Welcome everyone to our Sci-Tech Asia webinar series. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm an anthropology based at the University of Coimbra, and I'm one of the co-conveners of this webinar series. I'm going to hand over the floor to my colleague, Loretta Lowe, who is going to introduce our wonderful speaker today. Thank you, Loretta.
Thank you, Gonçalo, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Loretta Lowe. I am a co-convener of the Sci-Tech Asia virtual seminar. I'm an anthropologist based in Macau and the LSC. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lena Kaufmann, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of History and a research associate at the Department of Social Anthropology and Cultural Studies, both at the University of Zurich. So she studied anthropology and sinology in Rome, Berlin, Shanghai, and holds a PhD in social anthropology also at the University of Zurich. She spent nearly 4 years doing research in China, where she has conducted research primarily on migration in the city and countryside. She is the author of a new book called Rural Urban Migration and Agro-Technological Change in Post-Reform China. It's open access, so I encourage everyone to go on to the websites and download and read it. So today she will be talking about, her talk title is The Agriculture and Migration New Links in China, A View from the Field. So without further ado, I will pass the stage to Lena.
Yes, thank you, Loretta, for the introduction and for the invitation. So I will share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to present 4 parts of my book that Loretta just mentioned, and I will start with my introduction and with a photo from Shanghai in 2008. So what you see here in the middle, where you see a woman standing there, that is actually a small restaurant selling spicy noodle soup at the outskirts of the former French concession in 2008. And the Wu family who ran this restaurant, they are migrant workers from Anhui province. And at that time, they had been living in Shanghai for 8 years already. And before, they had lived in other places in China. And they left their children and their elderly relatives behind.
There's also the view stream on Facebook.
There's somebody who has the microphone on, I think. So, and they called their children and the people they left behind once a week from a telephone booth, because obviously they really missed them a lot. They only saw them once a year. And at that time, mobile phones were not common yet and affordable, and they couldn't always call. So they just stayed in touch once a week by phone, and once a year they went to visit. And on one visit, they took me home to Anhui, to their hometown, and there it really struck me to see that they were maintaining their rice fields. So during years of absence away, they did not just let their fields lay fallow, but the fields were neatly harvested and cultivated. So I found this really interesting. But I jumped now 2 years ahead in 2010. This is the same scene. And as you see, the restaurant was gone. The whole block was about to disappear. And this was due to a beautification campaign in Shanghai in the advent of the major World Fair Expo in 2010. So that expo was held under the slogan, "Better City, Better Life." And shabby blocks like this, which provided homes for migrant workers, were not found to fit this better image of a better city. So the Wu family, they had known several months in advance that this might happen, that the block might be torn down and they would need to move, but they were not informed about when exactly. So when it happened, at the beginning, they didn't have a place to go, and Mr. Wu then relied on the help of his fellow villagers and the help of his extended family to get him through this difficult time. And his wife, meanwhile, returned home for several years to take up rice farming again. Only when he finally managed to set up a new business that would support both of them, which took him several years, she rejoined him again in the city. And there are many cases like this of migrant workers encountering adversities in the cities, and also, for example, in case of sicknesses or for other reasons. And so for them, the fields really provide a crucial safety net. And I found that there are a lot of strategic efforts made to maintain these fields back home, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So my research draws on ethnographic fieldwork, first in 2006 to 2008 in Shanghai and Anhui province, and then in 2010 and 11 in Hunan province, where I focused then in Hunan on the rural side of migration. I started out from the urban side of migration. And I also draw on written sources such as local gazetteers, proverb collections, agricultural statistics and reports, and some follow-up interviews I conducted until 2017. So you see these two provinces on the map, and after Sichuan province, Anhui and Hunan are the nation's second and third sending provinces for internal migrants. They are also, especially Hunan, one of the major rice growing areas. And on a national scale, since the opening policies and reform policies of the 1980s, actually 1/5 of the entire Chinese population has migrated. And this corresponds to more than 1/3 of Chinese farmers that have become migrants. Most of them have moved to the big cities on the East Coast. And this actually means that on average, every Chinese rural household has at least one migrant member. Usually it's the middle generation that migrates, with somewhat more men than women. And meanwhile, those who stay are usually children, women, elderly, and sick people. And this is a well-known migration pattern in China, which many of you will be familiar with. But by focusing on the role of farmland in migration, I would like to contribute a new perspective on why this pattern remains so common. And this entails comprehensively examining both those who stay and those who migrate, and acknowledging that both are part of a rural-urban farming community of practice, to use a concept by cognitive anthropologists Lev and Wenger. So I turn now to what I call the major predicament of rural China. I mean, especially with regard to rice farmers in China. And this predicament has two parts. So on the one hand, there is the field protection part, because with decollectivization in the 1980s, the tenure system has changed, and farmland, which was formerly owned collectively in the Mao era, was then contracted to on a per capita basis to individual households, currently up to a period of 30 years. But it's particular that farmland is still officially owned collectively, and farmers have contract rights and management rights to land. Farmland has become an important aspect of the social security of farmers, like I already mentioned, especially after the dismantling of the people's communes and the abolishment of the collective welfare system. But to protect these fields, there is a particularity, and that is that they have special, especially wet rice fields have special soil characteristics, which means that different than dry fields, they need to be cultivated continuously to preserve their soil quality and value, and also to prevent them from tenacious weeds. So this requires basically sufficient labor input of people who stay home and who know how to farm. But here is the problem, and that is the other side of the predicament, which is migration pressure. So with the reform policies in 1984, farmers were for the first time in several decades allowed to migrate, and even to some extent encouraged to migrate to cities. But then, as an overlooked component in this migration history, the introduction and broad spread of labor-saving technologies also set millions of farmers free from the land, reinforcing their push for migration. And there are considerable financial and social pressures to migrate. For example, at the time of my research, a single migrant construction worker earned about 3 times as much as what an entire rice farming household would earn. And farming households alone were only sufficient for subsistence, which means that that's not enough if you need to build a new house or you want to send a child to university, for example. But then, due to the HUCO system, the household registration system, or what is left of that, migrants in big cities like Shanghai or Beijing, they usually have only temporary rights to stay there and lack access to the better urban welfare and education system. So taking this predicament together in sum, it means that on the one hand, farmers need to protect their fields as a safety net through constant cultivation, which requires a sufficient number of people. But on the other hand, then they feel pushed to leave the countryside, which makes it difficult to care for the fields when the precarious situation in the city would actually require them to maintain these resources. And considering now that China needs to feed about 1/5 of the global population with only about less than 10% of the world's arable land, this question of what happens with fields in migration and how the country feeds its population is also not only a national question. So turning to my book now, like Loretta already mentioned, it's open access. You can access that from the website of Amsterdam University Press. And scholars from various disciplines have repeatedly stressed that fields play a crucial role in and for migration. But the specific socio-technical challenges in preserving this key asset and the knowledge needed to do so still remain largely unexplored. And this is what I tackle in this book. And with this book, I contribute especially to a recently established subfield of migration studies, namely materialities of migration. And I contribute a perspective on things that stay, paddy fields, and related embodied skills, which usually escape our attention because they often remain tacit. I propose that a socio-technical understanding of migration offers new understandings of migrant-home relations and of migrant-home dynamics. And along the way, I also challenge prevailing narratives about backwardness and progress. So I ask in this book, what are the challenges for preserving fields in this context of predicament, which I just outlined? Then what is the knowledge needed to do so? And how do farmers strategically cope with the predicament? So before I will answer the third question in my talk today, I will turn slightly briefly towards the knowledge part. And this is also an overview from my book, and actually a whole chapter, so it's really oversimplified here. It's the Chinese system of rice knowledge transformation, which I analyzed here according to the anthropologist Frederick Barth's system of knowledge transmission, who divides, or who says knowledge always has a corpus, media, and social organization. And so in the pre-collectivization time, what is important now is that farmers were mainly using manual techniques. Then during the collective time, there has really been a turning point, which was the state-introduced Chinese Green Revolution. And this Green Revolution entailed new cultivation patterns, new varieties, and also including hybrid rice varieties, improved irrigation, farm chemicals, mechanization. And it has actually been really overlooked today, the outcomes of this Green Revolution as a factor in migration and in household strategies. And these Green Revolution technologies, they spread incredibly fast. So after they were introduced in the early and mid 1960s by the state and by local officials, Green Revolution farming technologies had actually largely replaced conventional technologies within only 2 decades. So this is really fast. And this state advocacy of modern agriculture, or what is considered modern, also continues today. We see this in all of the current 5-year plans or #1 documents. But coming to the third section, the post-reform period, what is important here is that farming knowledge now in this context of rural heavy outmigration is increasingly getting lost in the young migrant generation, while migrants obviously also acquire new skills in the city. But if you take the overall rural village society, then you can actually say that farmers can now potentially access a broader repertoire of techniques and technologies, drawing on both pre-industrial and industrial technologies to cope with their situation and to handle that strategically. And many of these technological and technical strategies that I will talk about later, they actually seem new in the reform era, but in fact, many of them have historical roots. So I will now give you an overview of 12 land use strategies that I found common in the field, in my field research places. There are other ones, obviously, in other places of China, maybe, such as increased animal husbandry, or fishery, or growing grains for animal feed instead of human food. But I did not observe these in my field sites. And many of these here seem like like farmers may seem very rational here in the way I present them, but due to time reasons, I couldn't really go so much into detail with regard to the specific household cases, but I have them in my book and they seem more lively then. So, and these strategies, they can also be combined and adapted. And just to briefly summarize them, so the first strategies 1 to 7 basically sustain intensive rice farming. And these are the ones that are generally also tolerated or promoted by the state. Meanwhile, the other part entails de-intensifying rice farming. And these strategies, many of them are forbidden, but there's also some difference between what the central government expects in terms of the national sovereignty of grain and then what local officials and the local government does or promotes. And I apply here also a repertoire perspective on these strategies, which allows for a comprehensive analysis, which goes beyond examining only individual strategies, which is commonly done in the literature. And also this adds some historical depth, such a repertoire perspective on that. And many of these strategies, like I mentioned before, they span actually a longer time frame, even though they may appear new at first sight. So I argue that in taking land use decisions, farmers are pursuing larger projects, drawn here on Sherry Ortner and Judith Farquhar. And these projects can be, of course, the preservation of the paddy field resource, finding a marriage partner, ensuring security in old age, continuing the patry line, caring for or financing the children's education, safeguarding one's own health, or getting the best out of both the rural and the urban world in this difficult situation that many rural Chinese find themselves in. So the first strategy is to leave behind some family members. Obviously not an easily taken strategy for many people. But this ensures that in a situation in which land tenure is sometimes insecure, and maybe some farmers might be afraid that after migrating they will lose access to their fields, and keeping the fields in the family really ensures that they can access these fields again later. And it works usually well as long as there are elderly people to leave behind, especially the husband's parents. But even here on this photo is a woman I call Mrs. Law, and women of her age might also migrate normally, but her health impeded her from migrating, so she stayed home taking care of both the family fields and her own health. And then another strategy is to rent out the fields. This is a photo now from Anhui, while the other ones are all from Hunan. And this is what my Anhui interlocutors, the Wu family that I mentioned at the beginning, what they did, because they needed most of the labor in the city, and after their elderly parents had died, they didn't have people to take care of the fields, so they rented their fields to other people. And it seems actually that in China there has been a transition from more in-family arrangements to finding more external solutions between the early 1990s towards more land rentals in the 2000s. And this corresponds also to a shift in migration patterns, with more and more women joining and their husbands and migrating too. And so households then increasingly need to look for external arrangements, and this is a very common strategy. In 2016, actually, there were already 1/3 of the entire farmland in China that was rented out. And one survey from Hunan that was taken at the end of the 1990s found that already then more than half of the farmers had rented out their land. This is a legal strategy, and there have been some reforms recently to make this easier in legal terms, to make sure that farmers can rent out their fields and then also keep their contract rights to their lands. But still there is some insecurity around these land rentals as well. And usually people rent it to people who they trust, such as neighbors or relatives, and who have the necessary skills and will to take care of these fields properly. The in-renters, in turn, are usually households with many household members who have additional labor at home, or commercial farmers who farm large scale. And this is something that the Chinese government also would like to promote, this large scale farming. A third strategy is to return in the peak season, which in rice farming are transplanting and harvesting. And this strategy works well if you live nearby a city, so you can easily commute, but this was not the case in this green water village where I stayed in Hunan. But I also found some commuters, and they usually had flexible work arrangements, like being self-employed, so they could easily come back. For example, there was one case of a young farmer called Hugen, and he was a migrant worker working as a bigger excavator operator in Guangdong province throughout most of the year. But every summer he returned home for 4 months because his family was the richest family in the village, and they were the only one who had a combine harvester. So he returned home and offered his harvesting services to other farmers who had to pay him for this. So, and at the same time, he could harvest and take care of his own fields. And he really needed this money because he had recently married for the second time, a second wife. He had a second child, which at that time was born out of the legal birth rate. So he had to pay some fines. And he also was even planning to have a third child and really needed money for his sons to take care of. Then there is a strategy of mutual help, which is also common during the peak seasons, and this is cheap. And so farmers can cut production costs if you offer your own labor in exchange. For example, Mrs. Law, who's in the middle here, who we saw before, who stayed home, she needed to save up money to build a new house because her son was getting married soon. So she exchanged her labor. And this is also a very old practice in China. But the difference today is that you need to turn to more distant relatives and neighbors, as many of the people in the villages have migrated. But a prerequisite for engaging in labor exchange is that people are in the right physical conditions to offer their own labor. And this is very difficult for some elderly farmers, and especially if they also have the double burden of caring for small grandchildren. So some of these then will turn to the strategy of combine harvester. And this strategy is expensive, but it leaves some household members free to engage in other time-consuming activities such as migrant work or child rearing. It also raises questions with regard to the growing disparities in rural society. For ideological and for organizational reasons, it wasn't not common in the Mao era to pursue this strategy, obviously, but in the more distant past, hiring labor had already been a common practice. And today, the incomes from migration and also the new farming technologies and practices seem to have rendered hiring labor easier because the workers do not require the same degree of manual skills as in earlier times anymore, because you need different skills for operating a machine than you will need to engage physically with the soil and with manual technologies. And this image also fits another strategy, which is using labor-saving technologies. This may be mechanization, such as here, where you have a combine harvester as opposed to the technology of the sickle. But there are also other technologies, such as farm chemicals, that save labor and with very bad environmental outcomes. Also often a lot of the fields, up to 3/4 of the fields in Hunan, have actually been contaminated, according to one study. But this means that if we want to tackle also such environmental problems and cutting down the use of farm chemicals, we really need to take a broader approach and also to think about how to incorporate migration in these policies. To use labor-saving technologies usually needs financial capital because they are expensive and not everyone can pay this, although they're subventioned by the state, but still. And there's a very close relationship between mechanization and migration, which has been reported also from other parts in the world. And I have a whole chapter on that relationship also. It's multi-causal according to my findings, but I won't go into detail here. But generally the choice is very complex. It's not just the choice of either or. So many times pre-industrial and industrial technologies are used at the same time, and farmers do so strategically. And it's not a question of being backward, for example, if they continue using a sickle, but it has certain socio-technical logics behind that. And I turn to the 7th strategy, which is direct seeding. And this means less work because you take pre-germinated seeds and you toss them directly into the rice field, and you save all this labor, heavy labor of transplanting rice sprouts from, no, not sprouts, I mean, yeah, to transplant the seedlings from a seed bed into a main paddy field. But farmers need to evaluate whether to save this transplanting time really makes sense for them, because transplanting also has a lot of advantages. I mean, it needs a lot of people to do so and a lot of labor and effort, but then rice grows and matures more evenly, for example, and you generally make better use of scarce resources. But it's a very interesting case here, this turn to direct seeding, which has also been observed in other places such as India, for example. And because in China, direct seeding or broadcasting is actually the oldest technique of growing wet rice. And it was in the Han Dynasty that farmers switched to transplanting. And today's farmers seem to have never personally experienced the strategy before, or direct seeding before. They all grew up with transplanting, but then now suddenly such an old strategy has a revival, and I find this quite intriguing. So we have now looked at the first part of the strategies, and interestingly, now turning to the de-intensification strategies, is that nevertheless, more and more de-intensifying rice farming. So in Anran County, for example, where Greenwater Village is located, since 1949, the average yield per person had already, by 1998, already doubled. And today, if we look at hybrid seeds, it has actually tripled the yields, which is really very impressive. So in view of this, my experience is that the Chinese government also rather responds with promoting new technologies to farmers rather than punishing them for de-intensifying farming. But in terms of maintaining this national grain sovereignty, which is a core wish of the central government, it's also interesting that overall rice cultivation has shifted northwards in China. So this is in part related also to climate change. And now Heilongjiang province in the northeast has actually overtaken Hunan province and has the highest output in rice nationally. So part of this, what is going on in the south of China now of farmers de-intensifying their fields is compensated on a national level then in the north of China. So turning to single season rice, this means moving from one rice harvest a year to from 2 rice harvests a year, which is common in Hunan, to only 1 harvest a year. And along with the practice of renting out their fields, this was my interlocutor's most common strategy. It's particularly suitable, or I found this practiced often among elderly people who only cultivate enough rice for their subsistence. While circumstances differ today, it is also not the first time in Hunan or in general in China that people have switched from double to single cropping, as historian Evelyn Roski has, for example, shown. But here, at least, you still have 1 rice harvest a year, which means you maintain your field, but there is a much more radical strategy, which also happens despite all of the value and attached to paddy fields, which is to actually also abandon your field. In 2011, it was estimated that farmers in China were abandoning about 2 million hectares of farmland every year, mainly due to migration. Behind this, there are 2 strategies, 2 different ones. One is to abandon selected plots. So one reason for abandoning selected plots is related to the redistribution of land after decollectivization, because the government wanted to redistribute land as equal as possible, and not every land has, of course, the same quality, or maybe some are more distant in the mountains and some are close to the village, which has advantages. So to make this as just as possible, farmland was divided into different categories, and then every farmer received on average about 6 different plots in 6 different locations and of varying qualities. So when farmers now in Greenwater abandoned some of their fields, I found that these were usually fields that had low quality anyway, or were far away from the village, or maybe not suitable for mechanic cultivation. But there's also a second strategy, which is of some migrants who maybe migrate permanently, and they really abandon all of their fields. I mean, here you see an abandoned field, for example, and you see what happens. I mean, there is trash on this, there are these weeds growing that you barely cannot get rid of anymore. So it's really a long-term decision if you decide to abandon your field. It's not something that is easily taken and then you can easily recover such a field. And it is illegal to do so. I was told that in Hunan or in Greenwater village, farmers usually would need to pay a fine if they abandon their fields. But in practice, I found that this either did not happen or was not really relevant in farmers' decision-making. Another somewhat radical strategy is to build a house on a paddy field. It's what you see here. The foundations of this house are directly put on a paddy field, and also the other house that you see here in the front right corner has built on an irrigation pond, actually. And this strategy too is illegal, but it is very common. It has been estimated that between the mid-1980s and the mid-1990s, about 6% of China's total cultivated farmland was lost. Rural housing was estimated to account for about 5 to 6% that lost farmland towards the end of the last millennium, which doesn't seem a lot, but still is a factor. And this only began slowing down. I mean, the loss of farmland began slowing down sharply in 2006, which is officially portrayed in connection as a response to the national preservation policy of a 1.8 billion mu farmland red line. But it's interesting then to see that household sizes are generally have been shrinking, also in relation to the so-called one-child policy, but floor space, especially recently, has grown a lot. So between 2000 and 2018 alone, the per capita housing floor space of rural residents in Hunan province has more than doubled, from more than 30 square meters to more than 60 square meters per person. So sometimes it's also going up and building multiple floors. That's why that floor space is possible, because generally land is, whether for building or for farming, is a very scarce resource. And often these houses are underoccupied, which has also raised a lot of concern in the media. And the literature has also written about that. So there were reasons mentioned for this in the social science literature of house constructions are, for example, to attract marriage and business partners, to increase family harmony by providing more privacy and space, to enable young couples to have more spatial and financial independence from their parents and in-laws, having also more space for personal agency, especially for daughters-in-law. It has also been seen as a way of displaying a family's social face, mianza, and wealth, and as a way to secure support for the elderly in their old age by earning their children's gratitude by constructing or helping children to finance a house. And I found that against the law, this land is even also sold to other farmers. And this is tolerated many times locally, also because of the tax revenues that it generates. But on a national level from the central government, it's not allowed to do so. I have another picture here, which nicely contrasts the old houses where nobody wants to live in anymore now, and some of the new houses, which are now also have 3-4 floors or more. And so here we also need to keep in mind that the distorted sex ratio. So in Anran County, where Greenwater Village is located, in 2003, for example, there were almost 53% male of the population, while 47% about were female. So this means that more men had to compete for less women, and women also had more opportunities to find a marriage partner while migrating. House construction then in this context has also been seen, for example, by scholar Chen Chen as a rational household strategy. And in this case of building houses on farmland, it means transforming one valuable resource, land, into another valuable resource, a house. And both of these resources can be used long time. And in the absence and economic activities of the migrant household members, this relativizes somewhat the immediate impact of this farmland loss for the households, because they still have several plots to farm. And then turn to dry fields. Here you see clearly on the picture that the fields still have these shapes of wet rice fields, but you have other crops, vegetables like growing there. And plant choice is, for example, Chevalier Marinova and Peña Chocaro have shown, is really a complex issue because it is related to numerous factors, from natural and technical factors to cultural, social, and symbolic factors. And here also, in my case in China, the social factors are especially important with relation to migration. These subsistence crops that are planted in dry fields are usually much less labor intensive than rice. The most common dry crops in Anren were sweet potatoes, beans, maize, and sorghum. Since the reform period, the area sown with grain, which is mostly rice here, had decreased by almost 1/5. Planting dry crops has somewhat contributed to this decrease. But in spite of this, like I said, grain yields have still continued to rise. In view then of a long-term perspective and of a repertoire of knowledge, dry crop cultivation has also already formed part of farmers' strategies for a long time. As Francesca Bray, for example, has shown, rice farming has always had different seasonal requirements with regard to the labor needed, and this has rendered it not even possible, but also desirable to combine rice farming with other suitable economic activities as a way to minimize risks and to raise incomes. But what makes this dry crop strategy distinct now in the current context is that dry crops are now competing with rice in a really unprecedented manner. And here we also need to keep in mind that to switch crops alters the paddy field soil in the long term. So you cannot just simply switch back and forth between crops. You cannot easily, the paddy soil is not really suitable for vegetable farming, but then also once you have adapted it to vegetable farming and you want to change it back to rice farming, this is difficult. So it's kind of a long-term decision to take. This is the same with cash crops. And cash crops, as the name suggests, the income you gain from that is usually higher than from rice farming. The labor input is usually lower. And it is even a good alternative to migration for some farmers. In Anren County, the most common cash crop was rapeseed. But here I want to talk about one local cash crop called lamprush, or dengxincao in Chinese, which is quite particular. The income of this cash crop is more than double of what you earn from rice farming. And the spongy cores that you see here on the women's lap that she's peeling, they are sold as cushioning materials, either locally for coffins, for cushioning coffins, or they're also exported to Asia, for example, to Japan, to make tatami mats out of this. According to the Anren County Gazetteer, in Qing and Republican China, lamprush was already a major local cash crop. It was also, as the Chinese name suggests, it was, and also the English translation of this name, it was previously used for lighting. But then in the 1950s, the cultivation of this lamprush decreased. It was condemned by the Chinese Communist Party as superstitious, and also the introduction of other lighting technologies also made this crop less relevant. But it's interesting to see now that since the end of the 1980s, this crop has regained in importance. It is less labor intensive, like I said. It also needs less input of pesticides or fertilizer or something, so it's cheaper to cultivate. But it needs a lot of effort and time to process this crop. Like what you see here, the woman has a small knife and she peels each, each plant has to be peeled individually. And elderly women who, according to the Chinese gender division of labor, are normatively expected to work inside and to have manual skills. So this crop actually fits very well these expectations. Excuse me. So a lot of elderly women who stay behind now have switched to this crop, and I found that quite useful for them. And also here, while many of these cash crops may at first appear a post-reform phenomenon, farmers were already abandoning rice fields in favor of cash crops in the 16th and 17th centuries, as Evelyn Roski and Francesca Bray have shown. Moreover, today the Chinese grain market still appears less liberal than the market for other crops. And the decision to change to cash crops is often viewed in the framework of market liberalization. And then it is perceived as a rational move of farmers to gain more income. Due to offering increased tax revenues, this move may even enjoy the support, and there are also cases of local governments really pressuring farmers to plant new crops, such as tobacco, for example. But my findings show that while profit is, of course, a concern for farmers, it is not the only consideration, but they also make decisions based on the social organization of farming and the related knowledge and skills that are available in a migration context. And here, for example, if you look at fields and you look at what is grown and how it is grown, people situation a family has and is in. So you really see this migration situation reflected in the landscape of rural China today. And with this, I will turn to a very short conclusion. Just 3 main points to conclude. That paddy fields really play a key role in shaping farmers' everyday strategies. Ostensibly, technical farming decisions are always also social decisions that are closely interlinked with migration decisions. And more generally, we need to pay more attention to the material world of migration and the related knowledge and skills. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lena. It's wonderful. So I'm just going to post, because this talk that Lena has just given is actually an open access book, and I want to, people who want to learn more, and you can just go to the link that I just posted and you can download it. So it's wonderful. Thank you so much. For those who want to ask the questions, you could use the raise hand functions or type your questions in the chat box. And when I call on your name, please just briefly introduce yourself and your affiliations. So I guess I'll take the advantages as the chair to ask you a few questions. I really enjoy it. It's so it's such an important topic that until now, it has not been explored thoroughly. So I really enjoy it. I guess my question is, I think your book, I mean, I haven't read the whole thing. I've looked at it. I think your book and also in the talk, you focus a lot on the material aspect of the material aspect of making this staying and migrating possible. So I wonder if you can maybe say a little bit more about the emotional aspect. Like I'm sure this migrating out and coming back has an emotional element as well, even though it may not be the focus of your book. So I wonder if you can maybe talk a little bit about that, like maybe the nostalgia for the rural life, things like that. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Loretta, for the question. This is, of course, a really important point for the people involved. And I know that I didn't, for time reasons now, I didn't really have so much time to talk about the emotional aspect, but this, especially this thing of split families between different locations. And you also have cases that migrant mothers, for example, told me of their migrant children who wouldn't recognize them anymore when they returned. Or one woman told me, for example, when she went home, another fellow villager wanted to make a joke to her parents and said, she pointed at another woman saying, so look, this is your mother. And then the children who didn't know how their mother looked like were running after this other woman and calling that other woman mama. So she told me how really deeply hurt she was about this, and also other families told me similar stories. I mean, now they use maybe WeChat to communicate, which at the time of my research wasn't really in use or didn't exist yet. And so they see each other, but with little children, then the children, maybe if they don't see their parents often, they don't really recognize who's on the screen. And so it's really a burden for people involved in that, and not easy decisions as it may appear here. And yeah, regarding the nostalgia you mentioned, this is also there. I mean, people in the cities that I interviewed, they many times talked, of course, a lot about the hardship they encountered in the countryside of working very much and very hard, but they also mentioned very positively about the freedom they felt there, the fresh air, and they very often related to the quality of the products they farmed, of being more organic and more healthy. And so really also felt this attachment. And obviously, I mean, you also have like the ancestors who are buried there in Anhui. They were even sometimes buried in the fields. So this obviously also creates a lot of attachment to these fields. So the emotional aspect is very important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like from those 10 points that you lay out just now, it sounds like they were so rational and it was so very strategic, but like it completely makes sense when you talk about the kind of emotional burden of separating from the family and the hardship being a migrant workers. So I wonder if anyone wants to ask questions. You can use the raise hand functions or type in the chat box. Anyone? Guess they're taking time to maybe looking at the book through the websites I'm posting. Or so this research was based in I think Gonzalo have a question. I'm just going to make a short comment. You mentioned that in your bio that it was like 4 years, like during which was it like you mentioned about 2006, and so what's the period of the research? Like it spanned over decades, I said.
Yes, I spent 4 years of that time living in China, but really conducting research for this book's topic was about 19 months altogether. Right. So one period in the city, mainly in Shanghai, and then one period focused on Hunan. And yeah, so it's kind of difficult to separate this time, because even when you live, and I mean, you encounter so many people that you talk to, and a lot of these just everyday experiences have also flown into this book, even though I wasn't always explicitly making research on this topic.
Absolutely. Gonzalo, your turn.
Thank you so much, Lena. I really enjoyed your presentation. I mean, in part because it's so rare these days to hear about rural China that it's really great to have someone showing what's happening and how important agricultural land still is to people, even to those that are engaging in migration to cities. I have a couple of comments and one or two questions. One is, I was a bit struck by your timing of the Green Revolution, which you largely circumscribed in the presentation to to the Maoist period, because it seems to me that, at least this is my experience in rural areas, that fertilizers and pesticides were not really widespread in China well into the 90s. That's when they were really massified. So I think that's and that's not a minor point, in the sense that that's also an important labor-saving technology that has enabled farmers to engage in labor migration, especially in the first stretch of the reform period. I would say the 80s and 90s. I mean, fertilizers and pesticides were key to actually allow for the sustenance, for the sustenance of intensive rice farming, being done with less people and a lot of people going out into the cities to work. But I'm sure that you probably point that out in your book. I mean, that's also important in the sense that brings also the materialities of farming that are probably part of the story that you want to tell, given that, depending on how you farm the land, that there's going to be different implications for people's relationships with the land as well. I mean, if you're farming with a lot of people and not much chemical fertilizer and pesticide, you're achieving a certain outcome in terms of relational outcome with the land. If you're using a lot of fertilizer and a lot of pesticide, obviously you're also achieving a very different, significantly more toxic relationship with the land. I was a bit struck, and this is probably one of my questions, I was a bit struck by your use of the notion of strategies that you didn't quite explain, and I think you would probably need to explain a little bit more. Because it seemed to me that many of the things that you were calling strategies could well have been described as well as the absence of choice, really. I mean, the outcome of political economy and constrained larger forces that are well beyond the control of farmers. And I think political economy is a very important part of the story of what's happening in rural China. I was also struck by the absence of agribusiness corporations in your story. I mean, that's certainly part of the story in many other provinces in China, that agribusiness corporations are coming in and are renting land from farmers at very cheap prices, thus contributing to a very different pattern of land usage. Which sort of leads me to, so I mean, fertilizers, political economy, that's already a lot, agribusiness corporations, and also a question about paddy fields specifically, which I thought was interesting. I was struck by your conclusion. Again, because the reform period is so long, it really depends on what period you're talking about, 80s, 90s, the last 10 years, and so on and so forth. Like 20 years ago, it certainly was true that paddy fields were still, very vibrant, and, migrant families were still engaging very actively with rice fields. But I think in the last, 10, 15 years, I would say there's been a significant decrease, as you actually point out to some extent towards the last part of your presentation. So I suppose the question to me is China going to evolve into some kind of Japanese model in which, attachment to rice farming is going to be maintained largely on the grounds of subsidization, because it's not viable economically for farmers, that somehow both people, farmers, and the nation is emotionally, to go back to Loretta's question, attached to rice. And so therefore it's worthwhile, it must be a national project of preserving this attachment to rice. Okay, so a lot of questions. You can pick and choose whatever you want to answer. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for all of the questions. Yeah, first of all, for the timing of the Green Revolution, you're of course absolutely right, and I explained that also in the book. So, but didn't become so clear here. So that was really introduced in the 1960s and 70s, but then it's mainly from the mid 1980s or from the 1980s onwards that these have really been spread widely. And so this is why I also in the book refer to, I describe this together, the opening policies, everything that has happened in the early reform period, and then also this spread of green or post-green revolution technologies. So, and then about my notion of strategy, yes, of course, farmers in a way don't have a lot of choices, but what I try really in this book also is to not victimize the people, but really to highlight the agency that they have despite all of these structural constraints which obviously are there. So I draw here a little bit also on other anthropologists or social scientists of agriculture, for example, the Dutch scholar Jan Douwe van der Ploeg, and who really shows that in these little farming tasks, such as fertilizing, which are not outspoken, but usually tacit, but you really find a lot of agency in these little tasks. So this is something that I'm highlighting in this book. But of course, the structure agency complex is always there, and the structure is always looming and limiting choices. Then the absence of agribusiness corporations, yes, it's also something that I heard about from other parts of China, that this is coming, and I imagine by now, I couldn't go back recently also because of the pandemic, but by the time I was there were not yet these big corporations. There were just more individual farmers who made up some agribusiness, but at the time I was there, this was still small scale, but I'm sure this must have changed by now. I also read recently that, for example, the government of Hunan province to respond to this problem of farmers cultivating only one rice harvest a year, which they attributed to farmers not wanting to raise seedlings anymore because this was so tiring and so difficult. So they responded by setting up smart glass houses where seedlings were raised, so farmers could directly purchase these seedlings and then transplant that again. So there are some state actors also coming in now that seems to be happening. So what, I have to think about the other questions. So that about the Japanese model and maintain subsidization, and
why keep on cultivating rice fields at all? It's not profitable at all, so why doing it?
For the government, of course, there's a strong incentive to keep this national sovereignty in grain and to not depend too much on other countries. And yes, there are a lot of subsidies to this, but I think I cannot really say yet if this is going to to turn into something like a Japanese model. I think I'm not able to say that, but it's something worth to investigate further. And I mean, it's always interesting, obviously, to compare the Chinese case to the Japanese case in rice farming.
Yeah, I wonder, like, if, like, in addition to the food self-sufficiency, maybe the symbolic value of rice in China as well. You can maybe comment on it later. I have another question for you from Juliet Tempest. Hi, Juliet. Juliet is a PhD student in anthropology at Stanford University, and she is researching about meat consumption and production in mainland China. So her question is, she said you mentioned that you didn't see much of livestock agriculture during your fieldwork, but can you say a little bit more about how your interlocutors understood the role of animals in agriculture, both historically and during contemporary period?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, great question. Or interesting research topic also to about meat consumption and production. Yeah, this was only something I only pursued, or I didn't focus so much on my research because I mainly focused on rice farming. I found by the time that I was there that there were some farmers breeding hogs, which was still also rather at a small scale at that time. And well, with focusing on farm animals, or the role of farm animals, I mainly looked at the role of draught animals. So not so much at animals used for consumption, but more animals like cows or buffaloes that are used for plowing fields. So there are some interesting relations also going on now with the introduction of plowing machinery, and then this of keeping farm animals. So by the time I was there in Greenwater Village, there was, for example, only one family who still had an ox, and they kept that also for different reasons, also as a way of insurance, for example, because you could still sell an ox. I mean, this is what was mentioned to me. I was then later also wondering, well, maybe you could also keep a machine as a form of insurance and sell that one, but that wasn't mentioned to me. So they only mentioned that with regard to farm animals. But yeah, with regard to livestock agriculture, I mean, in some parts of China, you also have what I very briefly mentioned, this strategy of that people increasingly grow crops for animal feed rather than for food, or even engage in full-time in something like hog or pig rearing rather than in planting rice. But I cannot say too much about it because I didn't observe this personally in my field sites.
Jun Chu. We can't hear you. Maybe, well, you've unmute yourself. Try again, maybe.
Can you hear now?
Yes. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. First, I thank you for this fascinating talk. I'm a PhD student in cultural anthropology at University Göttingen from Germany. My dissertation is about urban citizenship and the rural-urban migration in China. I only have a small question because it's just like it. I have heard about it during my field work. It's like, especially for rice field, is there like in your research, does it occur that like a small scale community supported agriculture, because it will produce more value to this rice production? And so in some area, it's become, especially from the migrants who are staying in the cities and get more information about it, and they will have this motivation to develop this kind of rice agriculture in their hometown. So I'm wondering if you have noticed that kind of phenomenon in your research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. I did, yeah, I mean, I did notice this a little bit, that people were, I mean, migrants were talking about developing their home places, but then I found that they usually did not focus on rice farming then, but usually had some other ideas, maybe also taking inspiration from other provinces or other cases of, and mainly focused on other products or on some cash crops that they could farm back home, for example, like medicine plants or something, or growing plants for then selling these plants to green highways in China or something like that. So I didn't really observe this so much with regard to rice fields. But yeah, maybe I imagine there must be some people also who want to develop rice farming more.
Okay, anyone else? We have about 10 minutes left. So if you have questions about the talk, please use the raise hand function.
I think there's one in the chat box. You want to have a try? It's Julia Thomas.
Yeah, I've asked that one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe I'll ask another question. So thank you so much. I was really intrigued by the strategies they're talking about when people are facing quite limited kind of options to kind of preserve their land. So I noticed that there is one strategy called renting out your fields to other people, just to make sure that the land is cultivated. So I was wondering how much does this take? I mean, in terms of the people's financial management of their fields. And what kind of state policies are there to help people manage that? Because as I think I read in your book, just briefly, because you mentioned that some people rent out the fields for free, and I just wonder, if you could tell us more details about that.
Yes, thank you. Do you mean with financially, or the financial aspect? Do you mean the people who rent out the fields and what it means financially for them, or for those who?
I think for both. Yeah, for both. Okay. I think it's for both. Yes.
Yes. So I found that it's, and I mean, this is also supported by some econometric studies that I read, that usually it's to rent out the fields is not a means really of making an income out of this. So there were some economists that compared the share of income earned from renting these fields compared to the overall household income, and it was almost nothing. I mean, not really worth mentioning. And I also found that I asked some farmers, so do you get something for these fields to rent them out? And they said, well, not really, but we get, for example, the rice straw, which then when we can come home, we can use as fuel for cooking. And yeah, I also heard that during the time where land taxes were still there, I mean, now there are these heavy taxes, as you probably know, have been abolished, but before 2000 or the mid 2000s, they were still there. And then some farmers even, it was reported in the literature that they had to even pay other farmers something to farm their fields because the inputs were so expensive. This then, by the time I went to the field, this was not the case anymore, but but they also didn't really make an income out of this. And those who rented the fields from others, they also did not pay a lot. And yeah, and in terms of state policies, I think in recent years, this is really an aspect that has received a lot of political attention and that has been refined, because the land transfer market in China was a long time not really so officially developed, if you want to use that term, and there was a lot of insecurity around this. And the Chinese state actually, I found has maybe two things in mind with setting some or introducing some land transfer policies. So on the one hand, they want to give more security to farmers so that when they are gone, they will be able to recuperate their land. But on the other hand, in view of making sure that there is enough grain in the country, they also really want to encourage commercial large-scale farming, and they want to encourage farmers to give their fields not to some relatives or fellow villagers, but really to some larger corporations who then will make very efficient large-scale farming. Although personally, I think that small-scale farming is in fact very efficient as well.
Okay, so I think we're nearly the end. So, but we have one last question from Wei Gang. Wei said, I also have questions about renting strategy. You had mentioned that there are families with excess labor in addition to commercial farmers, but he or she, I'm sorry if I didn't get your gender right. Wei was wondering about the shortage of such labor, and if there are capable bodies, why do they choose to stay instead of migrate like other villages, and what's the motivation to rent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a very good question as well. Why these people, or why many people choose to stay. I think this is something that also has been explored, for example, by Ye Jingzhong, a well-known Chinese scientist in this field. And some reasons that I found among my interlocutors, for example, were that some chose to stay precisely because of their children, because they felt that they didn't want to leave their children home alone. And especially when the children had to attend school, they wanted to stay and to follow up on their children's school career, which was considered very important. So this was one reason. And then, then of course, I also found many cases of people falling ill and then returning, but then they could only some of them could only do a little bit of farming due to their illness. I mean, they couldn't really offer a lot of labor. So these are two cases that come to mind spontaneously that I encountered, but there are probably many more reasons of staying. And that's a question really also worthwhile exploring further.
Can I ask a question? I know maybe.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Hi. I'm an anthropologist, but I'm an urban anthropologist. So my question may sound pretty ignorant. So my question is back to the technology part. So my understanding is that the areas that you're talking about is mostly for rice cultivation, right? On the technology part, how realistic or to what degrees that machine can actually be used in the whole agricultural productions? Is it at every stage, for example, from preparing the fields and then plant, or it only applied only to certain part of stage of productions? So I'm just thinking in terms, I remember was reading Seeing Now Yesterday when James Scott talks about industrialization of agriculture in the United States. And one material aspect of that is that the land tend to be flat and then large scale, large plots, and which makes mechanicalizations much easier, but that's very often not the case in Southeast Asia, for example. And so I wonder, in the situations that you are talking about, to what degree it can be used, what kind of machines can be used, in what sense this kind of machine is actually a labor-saving, a substitute, and what are the costs to do things like that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, that's actually a very important question, and there are a lot of differences between the dry farming and also farming these large fields in northern China and between farming small rice fields in terms of mechanization. And so generally, mechanization in rice farming has been later in China than with regard to dry farming, like farming wheat or crops like that. And I found in Hunan, for example, that there had been many efforts from the 1960s, 70s, 80s onwards to introduce new machines by the local government, but then many of them turned out completely unsuitable to local conditions. For example, transplanting machines were one case that for a very long time was in that locality not successfully introduced, and farmers stopped using that again. The other stages of rice cultivation, most of them have successfully been introduced and been successful. And when I was there, for example, transplanting in 2011 was still not, was done manually. But then in my follow-up interviews in around 2016, farmers then suddenly mentioned that they were now using transplanting machines. And so one of the reasons were of a financial nature also, because they said that before they couldn't afford it, but now with higher migrant incomes, they could use these machines. And also they said they had no other choice than using these machines, because otherwise they couldn't manage to cultivate the fields. And it's certainly very much more difficult to use machines in small plots. I mean, you need smaller machines, and especially where there are mountains, it's much harder to apply these machines than in flat areas, which was also some points that were mentioned by some of the farmers, that in some mountain plots they did not use machines. I don't know if this answered your whole question or there was another part to it.
Okay, I think the time is nearly up, and we have one last question from Marjan.
Hello, Lena. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I really like it a lot. My name is Marjan. I'm working at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Germany. And I have a question on the catch crops, because you talked about those catch crops. I'm studying the tea in Yunnan province. So from my own observation, I saw that, in this kind of cash crops like tea and sugar cane and bananas, all these kind of cash crops, the production of these cash crops is mainly based on small scale family production. So my question is, how do farmers in your cases understand their role in this family-based production of cash crop, and how they work with traders, those so-called middlemen and corporations, in the whole production, trade, and the consumption chain. And I have another question, if we still have time. You mentioned that the rice cultivation in Hunan is infected by the climate change. I'm working on the Dai people's rice cultivation. So I want to ask a little bit more about, how farmers in Hunan cope with this kind of climate change. What are the specific issues caused by climate change? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions. Very interesting research project also that you're working on. Yes, with regard to the cash crops and farmers' roles in this, so by the time I did research there, this was small scale cash crop production usually, and I did not ask really, I did not follow up on how they marketed these cash crops in particular, because I kind of had a rice bias to this. So I don't really know, I cannot really tell you about the role of middlemen in that, but it's, certainly a very interesting point. And with regard to climate change, it's not something that really came up regularly as a topic in my research, but I have the feeling that recently it has become more of a concern. And so one response to that is, for example, with choosing certain rice varieties that are, for example, especially drought resistant or you have a lot of choice. Also between varieties that are flood resistant or drought resistant or cold resistant or whatever. So one way of responding to that I found was really with trying to select the right seeds, which then with hybrid seeds gets a lot more difficult, because these hybrid seeds, farmers, these are usually produced by seed corporations, and then farmers often, I found, don't have the same knowledge about these hybrid seeds as they have with seeds that they really cultivate and reproduce themselves.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lena, and for everyone who asked questions and attending today. Like I said, the book is open access, so if you have any unanswered questions, please go download it and refer to the book or email Lena. So once again, thanks, Lena, for giving us a talk today. And I wish everyone a good evening, good afternoon, and see you in a little bit later. Thank you.
Thanks a lot also from my side for hosting me, and for everyone's attention and questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.